read completely your CV, but Ness said that Lars is one of the top voices in the industry, working specifically in the shipping container industry, and has co-founded the Sea Intelligence company back in 2011, later founded Sea Intelligence Consulting in 2013, and I understand that becomes afterwards Vespucci Maritime, which is now the company you're leading today. So thank you much, Lars, for being with us. And well, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure being here.
Well, Lars, many people has, asked about who is Lars and what is he doing at the moment. So why don't we start by, you letting us know something about you and about your work. What are you doing at the moment? What are the kind of studies you're doing at the moment in your company?
Yeah, you can say what I'm doing now. In my mind, it's the same thing I've been doing since I joined the industry in 2001. Back then, what's that now, 23 years ago, I actually started as chief analyst with Maersk. At the time, they were the largest container shipping line. And ever since then, I've more or less done the same thing. I spent my time looking at the container shipping industry from all possible angles, from container shipping lines, ports, terminals, freight forwarders, cargo owners, technology companies that come into the industry. And I always see this, it's a giant puzzle. There's a million moving parts, and I just thrive in trying to make sense of what is actually going on.
Hmm. Well,
So you can say, what I always try to do is I try to make sense of it, because from my perspective, it's not just about the numbers. Being an analyst, if you only look at the numbers, you're going to miss the big picture. The numbers are important because that gives you some facts, but you need to dig behind the numbers and also find out, why are people doing what they're doing? Only by combining the why and the numbers, then you also get an idea of what is then likely to happen in the future.
well, that is completely true. And that's probably why you have that poster in the back, thinking about geopolitics.
Oh, yes.
So let's talk about the Red Sea crisis. We have heard a lot of things about that, and it has been a lot of noise in news and so on. But I mean, what is actually happening there, and what can you tell us about the analysis that you have done of what is happening there?
Yeah, to maybe start at the beginning, the Red Sea crisis really began to unfold in November. The key player everybody should be familiar with here is the Houthi movement that's located in Yemen on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. There has been a civil war the last 8 years in Yemen, and you have the recognized government in Yemen, and then you got the Houthi movement. And over this 8-year period, the Houthis have gotten to a position where they now control something like 40% of the territory, including the nation's capital. During most of this period, even though it was a civil war, Saudi Arabia was actively involved as well on the side of the more legitimate government. Clearly, that was not enough to bring down the Houthi movement, and last year the Saudis actually had a peace agreement made with the Houthis. That aside, after we then had the flare-up between Israel and Gaza, the Houthi movement took the position that they want that conflict to end. They want Israel to back off. And they basically said, unless Israel backs off, we are going to attack merchant shipping off the coast of Yemen, basically strangling global merchant trade. At least from their perspective, the intention seems to be, well, this is political blackmail. Either you put pressure on Israel or we're going to shoot at your ships. And that's exactly what they have been doing ever since November. In container shipping, this really only gathered pace when you got to mid-December. Up until then, the container shipping industry didn't really pay much notice. There were a few attacks, not very many. It started with a car carrier vessel that got basically hijacked by the Houthis. Case in point, this vessel is still laying off the Yemen coastline. The crew is still held hostages on that vessel ever since November. But in mid-December, you had a day where 3 different container ships were attacked with missiles and attack drones. Nothing major happened, but the risk is important here. The first thing everybody needs to have in their mind is the large container ships, the one especially that goes between Asia and Europe, they're the ones that can take more than 20,000 containers. In physical dimensions, they are just as big as an American aircraft carrier. That gives a sense of scale.
Yeah.
That also means if I hit this ship with an attack drone or even with a missile, sure, it can create some damage, but it is definitely not going to sink a ship. You are not going to sink a major container ship by hitting it with a couple of drones. That's just not going to happen. But that's not the risk. The risk is if you have a fire that goes out of control on deck amongst those 20,000 containers. We actually have a previous case of that. That's 6 years ago. That was not an attack. It was an industrial accident in the Indian Ocean. A Maersk vessel with 15,000 containers on board, one of the containers caught fire. The fire grew out of control. 5 seafarers died, and there was a loss of $500 million simply from a fire breaking out in one container. On December 14th, a Hapag-Lloyd vessel was hit by a missile from the Houthis, and a container on deck caught fire. They were lucky they were managed to put out the fire, so no major damage. But that was the point where all the major container lines said, this is too risky. We are going to go around Africa instead. There was then a decision by especially the US, then UK, and gradually more and more countries to send naval vessels down to the southern part of the Red Sea to protect the vessels. The US, UK, and also a French destroyer, they came down to the region around Christmas. And that initially led to both Maersk and CMA CGM deciding now they would use the Suez rounding again because they would be protected by the Navy. A week into this, one of the Maersk vessels, the Maersk Hangzhou, was attacked by missiles twice within a day. So the Houthis clearly don't care that there's somebody shooting at them. They will just still send missiles. And that caused Maersk to change their minds. So now they went around Africa again. CMA CGM, the next day, on January 2nd, they had a container vessel that got attacked. But they didn't change their mind. They continued. They continued throughout January, but in early February, yet another CMA CGM vessel was attacked, which prompted the French carrier to also say, well, this is now too dangerous. We are also going to go around Africa. Making matters even more confusing, yesterday, a large French container ship actually did make the transit with French naval protection. And over the next day or two, a couple more big French container ships are going to make the transit. So it's not completely black and white. Overall, it would be correct to say all the global container lines, they are just going around Africa. They don't want to be shot at. CMA CGM have a few vessels they're still gambling with. If you look at smaller container lines, it's a completely different picture. You have a whole range of Asian niche carriers, so not global ones. They are definitely going between Asia and the Red Sea, servicing especially the Saudi market. They are not reducing operations, they're increasing operations. Whatever vessels they can get, they're sending through. Nobody's shooting at them. Then you have a range of small Chinese niche carriers. These are carriers that got started 2 years ago. That's when the Russia-Ukraine war started. Because with all the Western sanctions on Russia, suddenly there was a market niche for somebody willing to send cargo between China and the Russian Black Sea ports. Those were Chinese niche carriers. They are also going through the Red Sea. So whilst the majority of Asia-Europe cargo definitely goes around Africa, small niche cargo still goes through that region. That doesn't mean the region is safe. Just here today, about 3-4 hours ago, another vessel was hit by missiles and is right now on fire in the Gulf of Aden. Since the military down there began bombing raids on Yemen, that's been going on now for about 5-6 weeks. This has done nothing to change the situation. If anything, over the last 2 weeks, the number of missiles being shot at merchant vessels, the number of attacks is increasing. It's not decreasing. So the crisis is nowhere near being resolved. It's actually going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, that's not good news, really. But perhaps something obvious for you is let's say the crucial importance of the area for for international traffic, for international shipping.
Yes.
What perspective, general perspective, could you give us as to as to the importance of the area. We do remember the back in 2021, the Ever Given
The Ever
situation.
Given that got stuck, yes. So let's try to put it into perspective. First things first, I mean, the Suez Canal, how much of world traffic goes through, it depends a little bit on whether you measure the value of the goods or the weight of the goods and how you slice and dice it. But in very round numbers, between 15 and 20% of all global trade is sailed through the Suez Canal. And of course, this situation does not impact the Suez Canal directly. That's in the north end of the Red Sea. This is at the southern end, but it prevents the access going into the Red Sea and therefore renders the Suez Canal useless for all the ships that go around. That's the magnitude of it. Then we can compare to 3 years ago when Ever Given got stuck. I think many people still have this mental image of a big ship being stuck in the canal. There is nothing to be learned from back then to apply now. The situations are very, very much different. Let me try to illustrate that with a few points. In 2021, when that vessel got stuck, it was in a context where we already had massive pandemic supply chain problems. Those problems, even before the Suez Canal got blocked, led to a situation where we did not have enough ships in the world. That was the problem. When you then also block the Suez Canal, that becomes a complete and utter disaster. This time around on the container shipping side, we have overcapacity. The shipping lines ordered far too many ships when they were making money a couple of years ago, and they're now taking delivery of those ships. So when the Suez Canal approach now closed, we have enough ships. Sure, it takes longer. Asia-Europe takes 7 to 14 days longer. Asia to US East Coast take 4 or 5 days longer. It takes more ships. It costs more money. But the bottom line is we have enough ships. This can be done. It's expensive. It takes time, but it's perfectly possible. It could not be done back in 2021 because back then we didn't have enough ships. That's one major difference. But there's also another difference I think is more important. If you think 2021, it was very obvious to everybody what the problem was. There was a ship stuck in the canal. It was also very clear what it took to get it out. You need to dig it out with this tiny excavator. And it was very obvious when the problem was solved because then the vessel is gone.
Yeah.
None of that is true right now. We don't know what the problem is. I mean, the Houthis are saying this is to get a ceasefire up in Gaza. Could also be that this is the Iranian attempt to destabilize the entire region. I mean, the Iranians are supporting a number of different groups around the world. If that's the case, then stopping the war in Gaza is going to change absolutely nothing. What will it take to solve this? That is very, very difficult to see. It's obvious from the last 5-6 weeks of bombings that military bombings is not going to stop anything. It's actually getting worse. It is highly unrealistic to see a Western invasion of Yemen. So what's the solution? Nobody can see a solution. And how do we know when the problem is solved? How many days needs to go by without an attack before we can say, now this is safe? Since this began, or rather for the container line, since mid-December, we already had 4 different periods where for 5 days in a row, there were no attacks at all. And then more attacks came again. So there's not really any good comparison. We are now, tomorrow, we are up on 10 weeks since the container line started to go around Africa, which is, of course, a lot more than 3 years ago, which was only 6 days. But to also put it in perspective, 1967, when we had a conflict with Egypt, the Suez Canal also closed. Back then, it was closed for 8 years. So 10 weeks of closed now and going around Africa, it's a lot compared to Ever Given. It's not very much compared to the geopolitical problems back in the late 60s and early 70s.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. But probably you have mentioned some of them. But what do you think are the main, let's say, causes of this crisis in your view?
My view is I see this as part of a geopolitical development. I mean, this is my take on the geopolitics down there. I see this as Iran deliberately trying to destabilize the region. Just as they have for years been supporting, for example, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon with ad hoc attacks at times on Israel, this is another approach at this. For those who are very, very old like myself, you can remember the Cold War back in the 70s and the 1980s, where, of course, we didn't have a specific war between the Soviet Union and the US, but we had a bunch of proxy wars. I see the emergence of the same thing here. where Iran are using proxies across the region to destabilize the region. And up until now, with great success.
Yeah, that's totally, the one of the main causes. What do you think? Why do you think this crisis has been so prolonged? I mean, probably you have mentioned those as well, but I mean, can we just
the crisis here is very much prolonged because there's not much we can do. What I see this is we are now seeing what's usually called asymmetric warfare. We have seen it before. I mean, I was about to say, look at Afghanistan, where Western forces, despite technological superiority, had an extremely difficult time dealing with guerrillas that are just hiding out in the woods. And this is not the first time in world history. We saw the same thing. Let's look at the Vietnam War, where again, US forces, if you look at their material and their training, were far superior to North Vietnamese troops, yet they were unable to win that war because it was fought asymmetrically. And maybe in a twist of irony, go back to, 1776, the American War for Independence. How did the Americans win over the British? The Americans did irregular warfare. The British were the ones that had the disciplined, well-equipped troops. The Americans did not. So on land, that kind of asymmetric warfare, it's been around for centuries. It is extremely effective. It's the first time we are seeing it large scale at sea. Because what we're looking at here is you got very small mobile launch sites in Yemen. It's almost impossible to find them ahead of time. And you can just shoot a couple of missiles or drones at ships, hoping you will win. I can use then a $5,000 or a $10,000 attack drone. And from the military position out at sea, we need to use a $2 million missile to shoot that drone down. So not only is there disparity in cost, this is also contingent on that missile working. We need to shoot every single drone and missile down, otherwise a ship gets hit. And realistically, even though we can shoot down many of them, some of them are going to come through, and they have. So dealing with this kind of asymmetric warfare is not something the military forces are geared to do.
Yeah, that's true. And I was just, coming back to one of your points and, what you mentioned about they are not attacking some of the, let's say, regional carriers. Why do you think is that happening? It's just because of this plan they have to, just destabilize the region? What do you think?
Yeah, what I see here is the Houthis, their position is they will only attack vessels that are controlled by US, UK, or Israel. The challenge I have with that one is if I look at any given merchant vessel, the notion that you can assign just one nationality to a ship is a complete misunderstanding of how shipping works. Yeah. I might definitely have a ship that is owned in Malta, operated by a company in Greece that is listed on the stock exchange in London, flies a Panama flag, but is then on bareboat charter to a guy in Brazil moving cargo from South Africa to Australia, right? So for most ships, you can easily assign 10, 15 different nationalities. So assigning one nationality to a ship to some degree is a subjective exercise. When you look at right now we're at a point where more than 50 ships have been attacked during this crisis. Some of them, yeah, you can clearly say, okay, they might be specifically owned in the US or in the UK, but for quite a lot of them, in my view, it's a stretch of the imagination. Yeah, sure, you can find one of these many links that are then linked to UK or US. But I could just as well argue that they're not. In some of the weirder attacks we have seen a shipment of corn that was destined to go to Iran being targeted. And just a few days ago, we had a shipment of food going to Yemen that was attacked by the Houthis in Yemen. So the regional players that continue to operate to the degree where they say we are definitely not linked to US, UK, or Israel, then we are not going to be targeted. Part of that rationale is true. The problem here is, how do you ensure that your ship doesn't, in one of these many million different links, are not suddenly affiliated somewhere with a US or UK company? I think some of the vessels that got attacked, the operators and owners were surprised that they were actually attacked because they did not see themselves as affiliated with these countries.
Yeah, it's completely true. And as you have said, it's probably a complete, misunderstanding of the whole of how the whole shipping business actually works. But let's go back to the crisis and how it affects the maritime companies and the maritime shipping businesses. What do you think is the outcome for them in terms of the kind of decisions they're trying to make at the moment?
You can say, and this is going to sound strange, from a container liner perspective, if you look at it financially, this is good news. That sounds harsh because it's hard to call a shooting war good news. But reality is, just before the Red Sea crisis, I mean, look at the container liner companies. They were loss-making in fourth quarter. That's because of this overcapacity. And 2024 was going to be even worse because overcapacity would get even worse. I mean, like all other shipping sectors, this sector is cyclical, and we're going into a cyclical downturn. That we suddenly had to go around Africa. The reason we can do it is because of the overcapacity. That's why we had enough ships. But that also means now there's no overcapacity. And with no overcapacity, freight rates go up. The container lines, they are going to be nice and profitable again here in Q1. Here, perhaps some perspective is in order. Before the Red Sea crisis, a freight rate from Asia to North Europe would typically be between, say, $1,000 and $1,500 for a 40-foot. Then the Red Sea crisis happened, and spot rates then went up to $5,000, $6,000, which is certainly a massive increase. But again, to place this slightly into perspective, the 1,000 to 1,500 we came from, those were loss-making rate levels because the market was poor. Up to 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, that is clearly a rate increase that also exceed the costs associated with going around Africa. Absolutely. But we're nowhere near the pandemic levels. During the pandemic, we were seeing freight rates between 15 and 20,000. So yes, freight rates have definitely gone up. They've gone up dramatically compared to pre-crisis, but we are not anywhere near the situation we saw in the pandemic either.
Yeah.
So when you ask me what is the impact seen from a container liner perspective is very positive from a financial perspective. If I look at it from the perspective of the importers and exporters, this is of course purely negative. Not only do I have to pay higher freight rates, I also now have to live with much longer transit times than I've been used to.
Yeah. And why do you think, we have this overcapacity situation? It was just because the world was preparing for the next pandemic, or what do you think about this?
No, fundamentally, this is not really strange. This happened. This is why container shipping, basically all shipping sectors, tend to be cyclical. If you get into an upcycle where suddenly you are more profitable than you're used to, some of that money is then used. Now we can finance ordering new ships, and lo and behold, everybody orders ships at the same time, and therefore set the scene for a cyclical downturn a couple of years out. That always happens. This is no different. So part of why the market was weak, that was just normal market dynamics. The situation was then made somewhat worse by the fact that demand developments in container shipping last year was very, very poor. If we look at global demand as it was in 2023 and compare to 2019, so before the pandemic, the average annual growth from 19 to 23 has been 0.2%, which is exceedingly poor. So we ordered too many ships. That always happens. But demand was also a lot worse than what we're used to.
And okay, let's think about the solutions here. Do you think what's being done, it's, let's say, enough? Or do you think, the approach that the industry has so far on this problem is, somehow not enough?
I would tend maybe to phrase it slightly provocative here. To some degree, the industry has solved the problem already by going around Africa. Now, that was not by design, because they clearly didn't plan for a new pandemic. They definitely ordered too many ships. That's the truth. But you can also argue that because they did that, they built up a sufficient degree of resilience in the global supply chain. So when we were hit by a crisis like this one, this could actually be managed without it being a disaster. We're at a situation with even more vessels being delivered here in 2024. So if there really is no solution anytime soon on the Red Sea crisis, well, the supply chains will just continue to go around Africa. They will still take longer because we can't really do it faster than what we're doing it now. The extreme increases we saw in freight rates here in the early part of the crisis, they are already beginning to come down a bit. They will not come down to where we were pre-crisis, but we have seen the worst of the price impact. This is going to abate somewhat as well. So there is also some truth in saying from a supply chain perspective, this problem has largely been resolved already. It has consequences in terms of costs, in terms of times, but it has largely been solved. When I say largely, there are pockets where this is certainly not solved. Saudi Arabia is one place. You have an enormous amount of cargo that's shipped in and out of the Red Sea coast in Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. There is no way you can move that cargo overland over from the Arabian Gulf and across the Arabian Peninsula. I know some shipping lines are busy saying, now we are offering an overland option. And sure, they do. But the amount of cargo you physically can move overland is a tiny proportion of the total cargo. But Saudi is not even the worst part. This is where the geopolitical part comes in. You have a country like Sudan. Sudan can only be serviced through Port Sudan in the Red Sea. So what the current crisis has done, it makes it much, much more expensive to ship cargo to Sudan, and it takes a month or more longer. We have a civil war ongoing in Sudan, in the southern parts of Sudan. There's basically beginnings of a new genocide. NGOs on site in Sudan are already saying they're running out of aid for both food and medical products as a direct consequence of this. And the one that I think everybody should be worried about is Ethiopia. I mean, Ethiopia is clearly not on the Arabian Peninsula, but Ethiopia is a country of 120 million people. They don't have a coastline. Everything there is serviced through the tiny port in Djibouti. But with the Gulf of Aden now being a risk area, that means that the capacity servicing Djibouti has been reduced somewhat, and freight rates for going in and out of Djibouti have escalated dramatically. This means that we have 120 million people in one of the poorest countries in the world. Imported goods are going to escalate dramatically in price. The price for exports are going to increase, so it will be even more difficult for them to sell the few products that they are actually selling. This could destabilize Ethiopia that have just emerged from their own civil war up in the north last year. And this should also be thought into the context that Ethiopia is the last of the big countries in the Sahel region that has not already succumbed to chaos from especially Islamic militants, because you have seen that in neighboring Sudan, in Chad, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, and in Mali. Ethiopia is the only one, I was about to say, left standing, and the crisis in the Red Sea is serving to destabilize it further.
Yeah, and probably you need to think also about the pirates and the situation in the Gulf of Aden being even more complicated. What do you think?
It's more complicated, but in this context, pirates are not really that big a problem. Pirates can be, I was about to say, managed. If we compare to, say, 12 years ago when we had a massive problem with Somali pirates in the Gulf of Aden and also in parts of the Indian Ocean. Yes, it was a problem, but it could be partially solved by having armed guards on the ships. Yeah. The current situation, armed guards are not helping anything at all. The armed guards cannot shoot down a ballistic missile that's shot at you.
Yeah, that's true. And what about the resources of these Houthi members? I mean, they're somehow unlimited. I mean, because we've seen that these can, prolong, or we don't know.
Yeah, I mean their access to resources, that's really linked to the ability of Iran to ship more resources to them. And Iran is clearly sending more resources. There were news coming out, was it about a week ago, where the US military have sent one of their Coast Guard ships down there as well. And they actually interceded a ship that was going from Iran to Yemen with components both for missiles and for attack drones. So fine, they interceded one of those shipments, but that's probably more shipments than just that one boat.
Yeah, but probably it's a good strategy, huh?
Yeah.
Try to get them without, to stop the resources. Okay, and what about other markets? We have talked a lot about, the container market and how they can be somehow affected either positively or negatively. But what about other markets? Do you think other markets were, let's say, so well prepared for deal with this crisis, or what do you think about it?
Yeah, you can say if we other markets, if we first look at the other shipping segments, so bulkers and tankers. Tankers, the largest ones, they've begun deviating around Africa. Now, keep in mind that is not my core expertise, those markets, but at least as far as I can see, that has not led to a major disaster in terms of acute shortages of tanker capacity. We are still at a point where I think on average 40 to 50 ships, they do make the transit through the risk area. Most of those are small and medium-sized tankers, bulkers, general purpose vessels.
Hmm. Yeah, probably a different scenario. What do you have?
Yeah, when you say a different scenario, one thing we need to also keep in mind is this involves money. So you might have a small bulk vessel, and that vessel might be worth, say, $10 million. And it might be carry goods that could be worth, let's just say, 20, 30, $40 million. We're still below $50 million if that vessel was to be lost.
No.
A large container vessel, including cargo, has a value between $1 and $2 billion, depending on how full it is.
Yeah.
So that also puts it into perspective why it's all the very, very large container ships first that chose to go around, simply because the financial liability is enormous compared to the smaller ships. The risk to the seafarers is, of course, exactly the same, no matter whether the ships are small or large. Until now, the only seafarers that have suffered from this are the ones that are still held hostage from the Galaxy Leader, the first ship that got hijacked. But all the attacks, even the ones that have hit ships so far, we have been lucky that nobody has been hurt. But that's probably more luck than anything else.
Yeah, probably. What do you have we can expect? What do you think we can expect from Latin America being mostly shippers
Yes,
about this situation?
it's a very good question. The first thing I will say is if you're in Latin America and you have nothing to do with the Red Sea, you will be impacted. I was about to say nobody can hide. And there's a couple of reasons why you're going to be impacted. Reason number one is, as I said, we do have enough ships so we can also go around Africa.
No.
But we only just have enough ships. So that means that the container shipping lines will be moving ships around. If you have trade lanes where freight rates are very, very low, the carriers will move ships out of them and move them to trades around Africa, which are much more profitable. This is what I would tend to call rate contagion. So you cannot over time have a situation where one trade lane is extremely profitable and another one is not. People will move ships around. We saw exactly the same thing during the pandemic. We had niche trades where demand was kind of okay. Ships should be okay, but then ships were just removed because they could make better money somewhere else. Any trade around the world, including all Latin American trades, need to keep this in mind. If you're still enjoying nice low freight rates that you saw before the crisis, enjoy it because it's not going to last, not if the crisis continues. That's one impact. Then there's another impact that's going to be specific to Latin America, and that's related to the Panama Canal. I mean, the Panama Canal already suffered from water shortage, which had led to a restriction on the number of vessels that could go through per day. In November of last year, before the Red Sea crisis, a number of the large container lines took some of the services that used to go from Asia to US East Coast and redirected them to go through Suez. Then we have the Red Sea crisis. Now these also have to go around Africa. So we have had some of the carriers over the last month. They took some of those and they put them back through Panama. And now you've got to ask yourself, hang on a second. If Panama is limited in the number of transits, how could they suddenly move some of these Asia-US services back to Panama? That's easy. I would just stop some other services. And here's where, again, let's make a practical example. Say I might be shipping from, say, Brazil to California. If I do that, this should go through the Panama Canal. But now I'm competing with that space in the Panama Canal by somebody that ships from China to US East Coast. And overall, who wins that battle? That's the importers that are willing to pay most. And fast-moving consumer goods from Asia to the US, they tend to be the ones who are willing to pay the highest. So this could end up curtailing capacity related to Latin America that has to cross the Panama Canal, thereby increasing freight rates for all trades in Latin America that's dependent on the Panama Canal. We have even over the past few months seen a couple of small shipments between an east and that went south around South America.
Mm. Yeah, and have you seen any kind of strategies to deal with this kind of situation from, let's say, group of shippers around the world in different areas or something? Or do you think it is just, let's say, premature for people to start like dealing with the whole situation?
Yeah, there's not much that can really be done in dealing with that situation. To some degree, it's back to thinking the same way as we did during the pandemic disruptions. But again, keep in mind, this disruption is nowhere near as large as the pandemic. It is a disruption, but it's not the same kind of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
But it is down to plan for a longer supply chain, plan for a more expensive freight rate, no matter where you are. And the advice I've been giving all of my cargo owning customers over the last month here is the baseline you need to plan for here in 2024. Assume that the crisis will not be solved. Assume going around Africa is the norm for 2024. Plan all of your supply chain on that basis.
Wow.
Then have a contingency plan that you're ready to execute if it is solved and ships then go back to going through Suez. Hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later. But the baseline would have to be an assumption that this crisis is going to take a while.
Yeah. And what do you think about the efforts, that different nations involved are doing in the area in order to try to deal with this security issue?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's kind of dual, because on one hand, I don't see these efforts are going to be successful in solving the crisis. I mean, we can already see the efforts have not solved anything so far. On the other hand, doing nothing is an even worse option, because by doing nothing, we would basically tell the entire world that freedom of navigation on the seas, well, let's just forget about it. That's also not an option. So we're stuck here between a rock and a hard place. Doing nothing is clearly not an option. But doing something in terms of what we're doing now, yeah, it might feel good to bomb a few sites in Yemen where we find some mobile launchers, but it's not really solving the problem either. And how could we then potentially see a solution to this? A land invasion by Western troops on the Arabian Peninsula, that is completely off the table. I really don't think that's going to happen. And if it does, it would likely be a nightmare. What could solve this one? And this is where geopolitics come in. That is if the Iranians decide to back off. Now, who could get the Iranians to back off? The West, most certainly not. I think the only entity that could cause this, that would be China. So if this crisis turned out to be very problematic for China, that could be the key to then solving it. The issue, when I then look at the crisis from the perspective of what if you're sitting in the government in China, what does this crisis then look like? I don't see a reason to solve this anytime soon. For a number of reasons. First of all, the large state container line COSCO, they also have to go around Africa, which is great, because then they're also making money just like all the other container lines. What's not to like about that one? The small niche container lines from China, they still go through the area and are not being shot at. So what's not to like there? This crisis ties up an enormous amount of Western military resources, especially a large part of the US Navy, which means a large part of the US Navy cannot be used for any other purposes in, for example, the South China Sea or in the Straits of Taiwan. So from a Chinese perspective, this is not necessarily a bad conflict. They should, if I were them, I'd just fine, let's everybody else solve that one, not my problem to deal with. It's in their advantage.
Yeah, it's
so again, back to also why my position right now is this is going to take a while. This is not going to be solved quickly.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it will impact basically everyone. I mean, a lot of times we have been listening to this concept, I'm sure you are familiar with nearshoring, right? Why do you
Yes.
think? What do you think about this nearshoring kind of solutions in terms of what we did need to cope with this crisis? Do you think that will be part of the solution?
Largely, no. My position is, and actually has been for many, many years, nearshoring is not a major thing. It's a major thing when you look at headlines, and it's easy to make the arguments. I mean, I've heard it almost every year for the last 15 years. Now we're going to get nearshoring. There's a variety of arguments. Sometimes the argument is it's bad for the environment that we have to move cargo long distances across the world. Sometimes it's down to, well, labor conditions are awful where we are producing. We need to move it home where we can control labor conditions. It can be down to, again, geopolitics. We don't want to be dependent on production in a country we might suddenly be enemies with. And there's a whole host of different reasons. But the reason I don't see nearshoring as a big thing, one of the reasons here is this always boils down to cost. And sure, when you have a crisis like this one or like the pandemic, freight rates are high. But that is for a temporary period. If I look at this over 10-year periods, which is really what you should, freight it's not free of charge, but close to, especially for many consumer goods. Freight is not for all cargo types, but for many cargo types on containers, a very, very tiny proportion. So there's not much of a cost advantage for nearshoring.
Yeah.
Then you have the next issue, and that's one I see, especially when I have this debate come up in Europe. No, we're going to nearshore to Europe. My question was, okay, who are you going to hire to work in these factories? We have a shortage of labor force. We have a population that's getting older and older. We get an even smaller labor force. So nearshoring into an area where you don't have a labor force, I really don't see that happening. What I do see happening is a slight and slow shift, not massive year by year, but a slow shift out of China down to Southeast Asia and especially over to the Indian subcontinent. That's not nearshoring. That's just changing the sourcing patterns across Asia. India is increasingly much lower cost than China, and they have an enormous abundance of labor force as well. Then, from a North American perspective, one of the counter arguments that usually tends to come up is very recently, Mexico now became a larger trading partner with the US than China. And some are using that as an argument that there is nearshoring. It's moving from China to Mexico. That is patently untrue. The reason Mexico became a larger trading partner is because some manufacturing moved out of the US and down to Mexico. This is not nearshoring. This is outsourcing.
Interesting. Do you think like banks and other financial entities, because we have seen that probably, a lot of people around the world will basically suffer, and probably, the people who need the most this kind of help are not the wealthier ones. Do you think, financial entities and, other financial like banks and insurance companies, do you think they need to, help here in this kind of situation?
I don't see there's much to help with in this situation. One of the issues when the Red Sea crisis started, there was concern voiced that, oh my God, this is going to fuel inflation. And inflation, of course, is very bad for people in very many countries. That, of course, is nice to say from a political perspective. It sounds persuasive. Everybody can see freight rates are going up. Surely this must fuel inflation. It didn't run the global numbers, but if I look at it from a European perspective, this is where freight rates have gone up the most. If I look at the increase in spot rates, and clearly all cargo does not move on spot, but let's make the most extreme case we can. And then I can look at what is the value of the cargo that is being imported. The increase we've seen in freight rates from the Red Sea should contribute something like 0.2% to inflation. And that is in the region that's worst affected. So this crisis overall should not really contribute to inflation. But if you look back during the pandemic, there was also a lot of talk that the extreme freight rates also contributed to inflation. Back then, freight rates were much higher than what we're looking at now, but from a global perspective, it would amount to something like 0.6 to 0.7%, even during the pandemic. However, what I saw happen during the pandemic was that global shipping was an easy scapegoat. It was easy to point to not only the massive increases in freight rate, but actually point to the Suez Canal being closed. And a lot of retailers would use this to increase the retail prices of their goods, also much more than what the increase in freight would actually be. And the consumers would accept the price increases because they accepted the story that this was because of the increases in freight rates. Once more, a caveat, there are nuances. If I am shipping cargo that is extremely voluminous and very low value, this clearly has an inflationary effect. If I am sending cheap sofas or cheap large refrigerators, this is a genuine problem because the value of my cargo inside one container is not very much, and an increase of a couple $1,000, yes, that is a very difficult cost increase. But then you have other cargo types. I could have 10,000 pairs of shoes in a container. And if they're retailing at $100 per pair of shoe, a freight rate increase of a few $1,000s means virtually nothing on the cost and will certainly not in itself change the retail price. So yes, there are some shippers, there are some specific commodities where you will see a clear inflationary pressure. But for the economy overall, on average, this is not an issue. But there's political gain in some countries to be made that the economy is bad. It's not because we're doing something wrong in our country. It's all those, I was about to say, evil foreign shipping companies that are imposing this to us. From a political angle, that's an easy sell. That's probably also why we hear a lot about it. But in many cases, it's unfounded.
Yeah, but do you expect, let's say, despite this, do you expect the insurance premium to go up in terms of, cargo insurance and stuff like this?
To some degree, no, because as long as the ships go around Africa, there's no increase in the insurance premium because there's not any risk there. If you are then booking on some of the shipping services that do go through the risk area, what I'm seeing here is cargo owners are not really up to speed on the real risk they're running. Because I can pay a more expensive cargo insurance to go through parts of the southern part of the Red Sea, but quite a few of these insurances, they will not cover you in the real risk area because now it's a war zone. And here's then the next problem. If my cargo is on board a ship and my cargo insurance is invalid because it's a war zone, the next thing that happens is this vessel gets hit by a missile, catches on fire and sinks. Now the shipping line is going to declare general average. And as a shipper, now I'm on the hook for a general average bill, vastly exceeding the value of my cargo, and I'm uninsured because I was in an area where my insurance didn't cover. Over the last 2 months, I've seen quite a number of shippers that had no idea that this was the liability they were running into.
Yeah, that's incredible. And well, probably we need to be closing now, and I don't want to take more time from you, that you have been very generous with us. But let's finish with this. What do you think? What else do you think it can be done in a situation like this? Do you think that the industry has another role here, apart from what we have said about going through the Cape of Good Hope? Or I mean, is anything else we can do?
No, from an industry side, there really isn't anything we can do. It's one of these political issues where what we can do is to find an alternative solution. And the industry was very, very quick here in adopting that alternative situation. From a liner shipping perspective, there was a lot of disruption in end December and during January because all the vessels were kind of in the wrong place to go around Africa. That takes time. But now the services are stable, they're well functioning, they're operating. Yeah, they're taking longer, they're costing more, but this can be done. If anything, I mean, to maybe also end this session on a somewhat positive note, not only the Red Sea crisis, but also the pandemic showed just how resilient the global maritime supply chain is. Despite a sudden closure of the Suez routing de facto, despite a pandemic, despite all the things we've seen the last 4 years, we are still shipping more cargo globally than ever before in history. To me, if anything, this shows that the maritime supply chain and the shipping companies are extremely robust and resilient and very, very capable of coming up with solutions to problems they can't solve otherwise.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. So it's probably a good idea to start buying the Christmas presents, huh?
No, again, a week or a 2 week delay, compare that to the pandemic. When the pandemic disruptions were at their worst, the transportation time for cargoes into North America and Europe was on average 40 to 50 days more than normal. So now that we need to deal with 7 to 14 days, that's nothing compared to what we just did during the pandemic.
Yeah, I know, but I think we all got your message. We need to plan our supply chain, thinking, long term, not
Yeah.
just what's
Exactly. And don't hope for a short-term solution to this crisis. Take it as an unexpected bonus if it gets solved quickly, but plan for this to last at least for the rest of this year.
Yeah, plan for the worst. Thank you very much, Lars, for being with us today. And hopefully, as you have said, I mean, we're gonna, well, the world will have to deal with this, and we will find a way to manage through these waters. Hopefully, to navigate through solution in the short term. Hopefully.
Hopefully, yes.
Thank you for this, and well, hopefully we'll have you again in the future in Carta Nautica. Thank you for being with us on behalf of the university, the Externado University, and our Department of Commercial Law. Thank you very much for being with us, Lars. It was a pleasure, and we are very honored.